Today, I am very lucky to have Harvard faculty associate, lawyer, and anthropologist Petra Molnar on the program. Thank you for being on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. There's a lot to go through, understand, and get a bigger picture of from your perspective. So today we're focusing on migration and technology and the people caught in the middle. So, as I said, my guest is Petra Molnar. A little background about her. She has just finished The Walls Have Eyes: Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, a book that offers a global story of the sharpening of borders through technological experiments, while also introducing strategies of togetherness across physical and ideological borders. So, really looking to talk more about this. But before we even get there, I'd love to hear your backstory. What brought you down this path? The lawyer, the anthropologist, and then, of course, writing the book.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. It's been a wild ride for sure. It took me about 6 years to do this book, and what really brought me to it was my own personal story of migration. You know, I, like many people, have crossed various borders and have had real lived experience of what it's like to be a migrant and coming from a low income family as well of mixed heritage. It really was always an issue I was interested in. But it was interesting, I never planned to be a lawyer or write a book like this. I stumbled into it as a way to maybe try and understand how power operates in society and why it always seems to be that certain groups are excluded from conversations that really are pertinent to them. And, when I became a lawyer, I always also struggled with the power dynamics in court and how difficult it really is to tell people's complex stories. And then the tech angle kind of also happened accidentally. There seems to be a bit of a trend, I suppose, in my life, where I stumble into these things. But, in about 2018, so 6 years ago now, a colleague of mine and I started thinking, what's happening with immigration and tech? Like, are there any very problematic issues and human rights abuses that we need to be aware of? We just so happened to come across some work that the Canadian government was doing kind of secretly, introducing algorithms and automated decision making into its immigration system. And so we wrote this report, and trust me, no one was more surprised than me at how much attention this little piece of work got. And that's what really catapulted me on this kind of global journey to try and stitch together these stories across different borders to try and illuminate how technology and migration intersect.
Fantastic. No, I really appreciate that background. So, as you have lived all over the place, been to many different locations around the world. And as we, as humans across the globe, are experiencing what I always talk about as an exponential growth of technology, how do you see these two coming together? And obviously, there's some issues with it from your perspective. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that in terms of what your view is happening around the world with migration and technology as they sort of intersect.
Yeah, so, I've been really lucky to be able to take a global approach to this and try and understand how different contexts kind of interplay together. Because at this point, a person's journey is impacted by technology at every single aspect. Before they even cross the border, you might be facing things like social media scraping or states kind of taking a look at what you're doing online. When you're at the border or in a refugee camp or in situations of humanitarian emergency, there's a lot of biometrics, different types of surveillance, different projects that are being kind of played out and experimented with. And even some really, really kind of sharp, hard line projects that are quite dystopic, like robodogs, for example, being announced at the US-Mexico border, or AI lie detectors being tested out at European airports. And then there's also stuff that happens, after you already enter a country and maybe you are, wanting to reunite with your spouse or get a work visa. Algorithmic decision making is making its way into all of these facets, the kind of life cycle of a person's migration journey. But a lot of it is still very opaque and very much not talked about. The transparency element is a big one here because states and the kind of powerful actors that are involved in this, like the private sector, often don't want human rights monitors or journalists to know what they're doing because they like to experiment with technologies that maybe wouldn't be allowed in other spaces. The border is a really unique kind of context because it's kind of this testing ground that allows for tech to play out in ways that maybe wouldn't be allowed in other spaces.
It's really interesting to think about, and I think I mentioned this to you earlier, but I'm clearly I'm a technologist. I've been in the space since I was a little boy,
Mm.
by myself in a room, just working on a computer, wherever the case was, way back when, and I'm still involved in that type of level of work. But I clearly I talk about these things all the time. But I also, right after undergrad, I volunteered in Mexico and I taught third and fourth
Mhm.
graders in Tecolote, which is a small town just south of California in a suburb, so to speak, a very rural section of
Mm.
Tijuana. And so I got to know families and I was teaching their kids, and I saw definitely the differences of even class there. So there were kids that had literally nothing, no running water, no electricity, lived in shacks. And then there were kids that actually had some money because their parents would go up to the border an hour north, work on the border or close to the border, or go back and forth over the border. And so they had money and they brought it back and it bettered their family. Um, and so, man, I have way too many stories to talk about that and not to go down that path too far. But I did see firsthand the stories of people trying to cross and what they wanted to do and what they wanted to accomplish. So it was really interesting to think about. Um, the part that I am trying to, and I went through, I read some of your pre-book before, not the entirety of it, but some of the things that I'm grappling with these days are the questions that you brought up just a little while ago, and that is, um, the technology that's used. So some of the stories are, I'd love to hear some of the stories that you've read or worked with or seen firsthand. I've also seen some that are kind of interesting too. One of which was, um, I think, Syrian refugees that went to Jordan, and their leveraging of blockchain, which I'm very, I love blockchain in many ways, and I think there's many good use cases for it. And the idea was people didn't have paperwork. They didn't have a means to identify themselves. And what it did was it allowed for individuals to, once they crossed, to say, okay, I'm this individual, this is my name, this is my place of birth. And you essentially have a permanent record for that point forward, allowing them to get food vouchers or money to work within that wherever they were in Jordan. Um, so I thought that was a positive story, but I think that there's also ones that you think might be very dystopian. So what other things are you seeing that have affected people and probably not the best of ways?
Sure, yeah, we can start there, but I will also say definitely there are use cases that maybe we can discuss afterwards that are a little bit more positive and also a little bit more community led. Because ultimately it's about people on the move deciding how they want to interact with technologies. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the bulk of my work over the last 6 years has been looking at the sharpest edges of border tech, like really the kind of violent manifestations in an already violent border system. I've gone to the Sonora Desert and hiked for hours into, this inhospitable but really beautiful terrain and seen memorial sites of people who passed away, kilometers from a major highway as a result of this increasing smart border surveillance dragnet that instead of deterring people, because that never works, right? People will still continue coming. Instead of deterring people, it actually pushes people into dangerous terrain, leading to loss of life. And there's quantifiable studies now showing that more technology and more automation at the border is actually very dangerous and leads to loss of life. I think deaths have tripled at the US-Mexico border since the introduction of these technologies. Another kind of area of concern, if I put my lawyer hat on, is the discrimination element of this. The fact that we know that a lot of these technologies are just very poor at dealing with complexities of human behavior and sometimes are borderline racist. Not to mention, facial recognition, not being accurate with black and brown skin, things like this. I'm thinking specifically, again, for example, to those AI lie detectors I mentioned before. Projects like iBorder Control, which by the way, the names are amazing, right? We have like
Right.
iPad, iPhone, iBorder Control. There's a paper waiting to be written there for
Oh
sure.
gosh.
But again, this is a system that purports to be able to tell the truth or to make a determination about a person, whether they're telling the truth or not at the border, based on facial recognition or microexpression analysis. I mean, we can have a whole conversation about like the fact that this just doesn't even work. But from a refugee law perspective, or even just a human perspective, like, how can an AI lie detector deal with differences in cross-cultural communication, for example? I've represented people in court who, for a variety of reasons, religion, experience, nerves, Don't make eye contact with a judge of the opposite gender, right? And what about the impact of trauma on memory and the fact that we don't tell stories in a linear way anyways? How can an AI lie detector deal with things like this? For me, that's really the concern, the fact that we are introducing these technologies without having a proper societal conversation about what this is doing and how it's sharpening an already discriminatory and a violent system for people who are exercising, an internationally protected right to asylum that's available to you and I and listeners and everyone on this planet.
All good points, and it makes a lot of sense. And it's crazy to see that these technologies have certainly crept not just to the borders, but into corporate America. So they're using these
Right.
tools for interviews now. So you'll be in front of the camera interviewing, and it's looking at the facial recognition, not recognition, but expression, and it's saying, okay, this person probably just lied about what they just said because they
Mhm.
looked off in the corner while they said that. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's this is more important, of course, the migration component, but it has crept across the board. Um, even look at China, right? So China's doing the social credit scores, and that is to me the most extreme of what we're seeing. My question now to you, because I'm really kind of curious, is while we're talking about migration and borders and the technology that's used there, how do we protect against this? It just seems like it's a natural, and I hate to say this because I've spent so much time thinking about this and talking about it with different people, but I think no matter what we see or what we do, technology eventually is adopted. I mean, people were nervous about electricity initially, automobiles, the telephone, computers, internet, vaccines. Every one of those things had a moment in time where people were extraordinarily nervous about it. So how do we, and nervous about it for good reasons maybe back then, but how do we move from this idea that these tools, for better or for worse, depending on the perspective, are being used at different junctures, will eventually just be adopted. And how do we protect against that for people that are most vulnerable?
Yeah, for sure. I think on some level it kind of feels like catching a runaway train because so much of this seems inevitable. And I mean, I think that's the starting point. We need to have a broader conversation about what is it that we're okay with and why. I mean, are we okay with having robo-dogs at the border or on the streets of New York City, right? Because the New York City
Right.
Police Department, to your previous point, last year proudly announced they're once again going to be using these machines. One was even painted with black spots like a Dalmatian.
Yeah.
Cute. But again, it bleeds over from the border, right?
Yes.
But part of it, I think, is having these maybe more difficult, thorny conversations about, are we okay with facial recognition at the border? And if not, why not? But to me, it's about these broader questions, right? Because, it's about technology, but ultimately it's about power. It's about who is in the room and who is at the table making decisions about what we innovate on and why. And I think that's where some of the work that my colleagues and I are trying to do at the Migration and Technology Monitor, a project that we're running directly with people on the move, who tell their own stories on border surveillance and border tech. I think it's really important to think about how we design technology and again, whose perspectives matter. Because like we were saying earlier, right? I mean, yes, there's this whole class of technologies that's very sharp and rights infringing and probably, frankly, should be banned. But there's also ways that technology can make the immigration system more transparent, more fair, give people access to resources, lawyers, psychosocial support, information. And again, it's about being aware of that power dynamic and making spaces that are open for people with lived experience to really be the experts in the room.
No, well said. And I absolutely agree with you. I think that's really, really important. One of the points I believe that was in your book talked about sort of this centralization of power among maybe certain tech
Mm.
organizations that are leading the way and leading the charge on some of these technologies that are out there. And I agree with you that that can pose a problem. So counter to that, there's a big movement, and I come from this whole world of decentralization across the board, whether it's blockchain or other tools, is the leveraging of tools that are open-ended, open source, that allow for more open community to work on these things. Have you gone down that path in that space to say that, okay, this isn't run by these centralized organizations, but this is something that's more community driven?
Absolutely. I think that's a really great example of, again, how we can leverage the power of technology to help with really complex situations. I'm thinking, for example, of open source investigations in conflict, right? And satellite imagery analysis and things like that that are being done in open source ways. I mean, that has revolutionized, for example, international prosecutions when it comes to war crimes, crimes against humanity, spaces that are very difficult to investigate otherwise, right? We have all these amazing outfits now, like forensic architecture, border forensics, other types of smaller groups that are using these tools in really innovative ways that frankly wouldn't be possible before, right? So definitely, I think there are ways that we can leverage the kind of almost horizontal nature of a lot of these projects, like the fact that it brings people from different lived experience together and allows us to work together in an effective way on these really complex problems.
No, so true. So I have been doing too much travel recently. It sounds like you have been as well. But I recently just came back from Munich for
Mhm.
an ABA, International ABA conference where I was focused on AI. Um, and one of the major topics, of course, is new legislation like the EU AI Act. Where do you see that coming down with respect to addressing high risk impacts to border tech?
Yeah, great question. And, full disclosure, I was part of a group of academics and civil society and human rights lawyers pushing the European members of parliament to try and think about the impacts of border tech when they were drafting the AI Act. We were part of a coalition, for example, called Protect, Not Surveil. And it was all about basically trying to get the act to have stronger, even a moratorium, for example, on some of the technology, such as predictive analytics used for border enforcement. So using, again, a technology that can be very helpful in, let's say, humanitarian settings, forecasting where a group might be moving so that you can deliver aid, then being weaponized for border operations that are frankly illegal under international law. I'm talking about pushbacks that have been documented all along European frontiers, right? But unfortunately, given how politically intractable migration is all around the world, it didn't go as far as we were hoping. And unfortunately, even though that the EU AI Act does recognize that certain border technologies fall under the high risk category, there's also carve-outs for national security and other types of use cases that just will allow this risk matrix to not be applied in the way that it needs to. And again, I think it goes back to that conversation we were having about like robodogs and AI lie detectors and other projects. I mean, I do think there should be a red line under some of this, unless and until a robust human rights respecting framework exists, having human rights impact assessments throughout, having data protection impact assessments, consultations with community, for example, right? None of this is being done. And one last thing I'll say about the AI Act at the EU level, it's also a missed opportunity globally, right? Because this is the first regional attempt to govern AI. And it's hard work. I do recognize that policymakers had a tough job in front of them for years to try and put together this massive piece of lawmaking, right? But the thing is, it has a domino effect, right? If it's weak on human rights protections, it then emboldens other jurisdictions like the United States or Canada or other places to also weaken its kind of governance making frameworks. And unfortunately, I think it's a missed opportunity because it could have gone much further.
So where does this all go? If we take this out 5 or 10 years from now, what do you think will actually shake out across the world, whether it's Europe, the Americas, Asia, with climate change, with increased migration across the board, which we're probably going to see because of multiple reasons, and the use of technology? Where do you honestly think we will be based on everything that's going on, both the strife that might be in various countries, because just the change of technology in and of itself, people are projecting, all right, this technology is going to affect my job. I'm going to lose my job more so in the last 2 years than anybody ever thought of before. I've been talking for the last 10 years. I've been talking about how people need to start thinking about changing their perspective, what they're working on, what they're doing, being open towards technology because it's going to affect your life no matter what. So you have this background of technology that's affecting everyone's life. Then you have migration because of multiple reasons. Um, and when you start to pull them all together, you're going to have what you're having now, countries around the world that are pushing back on these concepts and these ideas because they're also concerned about the bigger picture of themselves. Everyone's speaking from this sort of selfish, unfortunate perspective. if you pull all this together, I know it's not an easy thing to do, but if you pull all this together, what do you think what it'll look like in 10 years from now? Do you think there's going to be much more technology that's used for surveillance? Do you think we're going to actually strike a balance across the globe or in various jurisdictions? What does that look like?
So I'll give you the pessimistic answer and then the optimistic one.
Okay, that's great. That's perfect.
So I think definitely given the trends that I've seen firsthand across different jurisdictions is that there will be more surveillance and more technology. There's nothing to stop that development from happening, right? Again, because it's about power and powerful actors like private sector and states get to kind of set the agenda and say, well, more tech is better. This kind of techno-solutionistic bend, which unfortunately we are seeing, I think, like you said, across different sectors, not just in migration, but in healthcare and criminal justice issues with predictive policing and things like that. Again, and it's not that the tech inherently is bad, it's just how it is being developed and deployed and weaponized against marginalized groups again and again and again. Now, the optimist in me, though, I have also seen a lot of resistance and joy and contestation and creativity around, well, okay, this is the world we are in, but how do we leverage some of the technology to rebalance these power imbalances? And how do we actually, dream of a different world? And there's so much resistance, community resistance, also really unique ways of using technology, whether it is about, again, using established ways of communicating, using WhatsApp with refugees in different contexts, using, archival methodology for psychosocial support of folks on the move, like all sorts of really innovative ways that technology can help. And there's also contestation coming from the private sector. I mean, workers at Amazon and Microsoft and other companies are protesting some of the really vast human rights violations that are happening in these spaces too. So I do have hope that actually, there will be a bit of a sea change. And even though more technology perhaps is inevitable given the way that the world is moving, hopefully we'll get to a point where it's actually used for creating a more just and transparent way of working with one another and being able to also hold the complexity of human life. Because I think that's what I keep saying, humans are complex beings. There's many stories that we all inhabit, maybe many reasons why we might be crossing a border. And law and technology forces us to operate in this like small box, right? You're either a liar or you are not. You're either a refugee or you are not. But I'm actually hopeful that we will get to more nuanced, complex conversations that we can have together about what it is actually to be a human in the world today.
No, very well stated. And I totally agree with you, especially, well, I agree with you on both sides of that. The part that I would add on to the latter section that I feel very positive about from one perspective of why people migrate, and that's opportunity. I think in the future, hopefully, we're going to see this leapfrog technologies, all the technologies that we see today, and some that we're not even using yet, will be available to people globally that they never had the opportunity
Mhm.
before to do. I mean, you're seeing it now on the travels that I've done. I've seen people with $5 Android phones and luckily more access to internet than they've ever had before. The ability for people to use play to earn, which means that they are literally on their $5 Android device. They're playing a game. And because they've made it so far in the game, they win an NFT, whatever, a widget, and that widget is then able to be sold globally. And so they may have spent 10 hours in this game to reach this spot, and they get something, and they can literally trade that for $1,000 to someone that's somewhere else in the world who wanted that but didn't want to play the game all day. And they wanted that, which is kind of a cheating thing, but that is a huge thing that's happening in Southeast Asia, especially. I mean, the possibilities hopefully will be endless on that front. Clearly, there are other challenges on the migration front, not just all about about the opportunity for something, a job, whatever, in other lands. There's other things going on. But yes, on the positive side, I hope that that will be part of it. All right. Any other last thoughts or comments before we call it?
I just thank you for the opportunity to share. I know it can be kind of depressing looking at some of the sharpest manifestations of the tech that I've been lucky to see firsthand. But I always bring it back to my colleagues who are on the move and that I get to work with every day. I mean, it's incredibly inspirational as a person who was formerly on the move to again be working in these close kind of proximities with people with lived experience who again must be the ones shaping the conversation. And we're hoping again at the Migration and Technology Monitor to do our small part to upscale and incubate projects by people who are concerned about these issues too.
It's an important work, my goodness. Well, Petra, the book is The Walls Have Eyes: Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Joseph. It was a real pleasure to be here.